The morning sunlight bounced off the polished glass windows of the café, casting golden streaks across the sidewalk where the city's wealthiest came to sip lattes and talk numbers. A sleek black Tesla pulled up, its engine humming softly before falling into silence. Out stepped Richard Blackwell, 52 years old, a man whose name carried weight in boardrooms and real estate markets alike. His navy suit, hand-stitched in Milan, seemed to command the space around him, while his gleaming watch caught the eye of passers-by who whispered and glanced his way. Richard walked with the certainty of someone who had never been denied access, never been told no, never had to wonder about his next meal. He was in every sense untouchable, or so he believed. But before his polished shoes reached the cafe door, a voice cut through the morning chatter like a blade. "Excuse me, sir, can I have a minute of your time?" It wasn't the voice of a beggar asking for spare change. It wasn't timid or shaky. It was firm, clear, steady, almost unsettling in its confidence. Richard stopped, caught off guard, and turned. Standing a few feet away was a boy, 17 at most. His hoodie was faded, frayed at the sleeves, and his jeans carried the stains of too many nights spent on unforgiving sidewalks. His sneakers were torn at the edges, laces uneven. Yet despite his rough appearance, his eyes, sharp, focused, unflinching, were unlike anything Richard had seen in a long time. They didn't carry pity. They didn't carry desperation. They carried intent. For a split second, Richard thought about ignoring him, brushing him off the way one would swat away an annoying fly. But there was something in that gaze that pinned him in place. He narrowed his eyes. "Kid, I don't give money to people on the street. Find a shelter or a program. That's your best shot." His voice was dismissive, rehearsed, the carrot, and of response a man like him had given 100 times before. The boy didn't flinch. "I'm not asking for money," he said evenly. "My name is Tyler Washington. I'm 17 years old and I have a proposal that could change your life." Those words didn't sound like they belonged to a kid in rags. They landed heavy, slicing through the air, making a few people at the cafe's outdoor tables glance up from their phones. Richard felt his chest tighten with a flicker of irritation and curiosity. Who was this boy to speak to him like that? And what kind of proposal could someone who clearly had nothing possibly bring to a man who already owned everything? He adjusted his tie and let out a dry laugh. "A proposal? You probably didn't even finish high school." Tyler didn't blink. "I graduated at 15 with straight A's. I've spent the last 2 years studying the real estate market in this city. I know exactly where your next 10 million should be invested." For the first time that morning, Richard's breath caught, not enough for anyone to notice, but enough to make him pause. There was no stutter in the boy's words, no hesitation, just an unsettling calmness, like someone speaking from a place of certainty rather than chance. He wanted to walk away. He wanted to dismiss this as another street hustle. Yet something in him, the part that had built empires by spotting hidden opportunities, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was different. The city traffic roared behind them. A couple walked by with paper coffee cups, slowing just enough to watch the strange confrontation unfold. The cafe door opened, releasing the rich aroma of roasted beans into the air, but Richard didn't move. He stood there, caught between disbelief and intrigue, staring at a teenager who looked like the world had beaten him down, but who spoke as though he owned the ground beneath his feet. "You hired Shaw." "Ave 30 seconds," Richard finally muttered, crossing his arms. His tone was sharp, his posture defiant, but his eyes betrayed something else. A reluctant curiosity he couldn't quite silence. "Impress me." And in that moment, with the morning crowd watching and the sun lighting up the cracks between wealth and poverty, two worlds collided. A billionaire who thought he'd seen it all, and a boy who had nothing left but a mind sharp enough to rewrite both their destinies. The air hung heavy with tension, the kind that makes strangers stop mid-step and lean closer, sensing that something important is about to happen. Because sometimes the most powerful stories don't begin in boardrooms or grand offices. They begin on the sidewalk, with a single voice daring to be heard. Richard raised an eyebrow, half amused, half skeptical, as the boy pulled a crumpled sheet of paper from his pocket. Tyler smoothed it out carefully against his palm, as though the faded creases and smudges could somehow diminish the weight of what he was about to reveal. He glanced up only once to meet Richard's eyes and then spoke with the kind of clarity that made passers-by quiet their conversations without even realizing why. "Lot number 543, Tyler said, tapping the page with a finger. "The abandoned property on Central Avenue. Everyone thinks it's worthless, contaminated, impossible to build on. But it's not. The contamination is superficial. It can be cleared for under $200,000 using a new method developed by the university. That land isn't dead, sir. It's the most undervalued piece of property in this city." Richard's smirk faltered. He knew that lot. It had been on his firm's radar 5 years ago, but his advisors had dismissed it. Too risky, too costly, too uncertain. Yet hearing this ragged boy speak about it piece by piece, like a seasoned analyst who'd been poring over reports for decades, stirred a quiet unease in him. He tried to steady himself with sarcasm. And you just discovered this what? While cleaning up TY rash on the street? Tyler didn't flinch. I discovered it while working as a janitor in City Hall. I cleaned offices where people threw away documents they thought no one would ever read. I read every one of them. Soil studies, environmental reports, project budgets, things people dismissed as scrap paper. I studied like textbooks. Richard felt the skin on the back of his neck tighten. The boy's voice wasn't shaky or defensive. It was steady, almost surgical, cutting through Richard's arrogance with every word. And there's more, Tyler added, lowering his voice just enough that Richard had to lean closer. The city council has already approved the extension of the blue subway line. A station will open right beneath that land in 18 months. When it does, property values will multiply 15 times. Everyone thinks Lot 543 is a graveyard. I know it's gold. For a brief moment, Richard forgot the boy's ragged hoodie, the worn shoes, the faint smell of days without a shower. He forgot the pity he usually reserved for kids who lingered near his car. All he saw was the fire in the boy's eyes, the conviction that couldn't be faked, and he hated himself for it, because a part of him believed. Still, old habits rose quickly to the surface. He straightened his back, reclaiming his tone of authority. Interesting, he said flatly, but business doesn't run on rumors or lucky guesses. It runs on hard numbers, credibility, reputation, things you don't have. So let's not waste any more time. Tyler reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, metallic, and battered. A flash drive. He held it in his palm like it was both fragile and priceless. I've already done the work. 6 months of research, soil analyses, university reports, contracts from the subway construction firm. It's all here. Every document, every fact, every number you'll need to see what I all read. I know. You don't need to take my word for it. You only need to open the files. The world seemed to narrow in on that little piece of plastic and metal. Richard stared at it, unsettled by how much it weighed in his mind despite its tiny size. He hesitated, just long enough for the boy to notice, and Tyler's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. Not arrogance, not desperation, just a quiet certainty, as if he already knew how this story would end. Partnership, Tyler said firmly, 20% of the profits. I don't want your charity, Mr. Blackwell. I don't need a handout. I want a seat at the table, because without this information, there is no deal. The boldness of it hit Richard like a slap. A 17-year-old, homeless, demanding a partnership from him, a man worth billions. He almost laughed again, but the sound caught in his throat. Because the boy's tone, the way he stood tall despite everything stacked against him, didn't feel like a joke at all. It felt like the beginning of a negotiation. Behind them, the city moved on, unaware that in front of a café on a busy morning, 2 lives had collided. One was built on privilege, power, and the illusion of control. The other was rising from nothing but raw determination, intelligence, and the refusal to be invisible. The clash had only just begun, and already Richard felt something he hadn't felt in years: uncertainty. And uncertainty, in his world, was dangerous. Richard spent the rest of the morning at his favorite table inside the cafe, sipping espresso and pretending to read the financial section of the paper, but his mind wasn't on the headlines. It was on the boy, Tyler Washington, 17 years old, dressed in rags, standing outside like he owned the sidewalk, demanding a partnership from a man whose signature could change markets. Richard hated himself for even thinking about it, but he couldn't shake the memory of those sharp eyes or the calm way the kid had spoken, as if he wasn't afraid of anything, not even rejection. When he finally drove away in his Tesla, the city lights reflecting against the glass towers, the unease followed him. He told himself it was ridiculous. He had built an empire from nothing but instincts, ambition, and relentless grind. He had weathered stock crashes, hostile takeovers, and lawsuits. He had stared down senators and CEOs without blinking. And now, for some reason, a teenager's words had planted a thorn he couldn't pull out. That night, as Richard sat alone in his penthouse, staring at the skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, the thorn dug deeper. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light, and muttered under his breath, "Lot 543. He remembered the meetings years ago when his advisors dismissed it as worthless. He remembered Parker from City Hall whispering about how the land was dead. But now the boy's voice echoed in his head. The contamination is superficial. The subway line will pass underneath, 15 times the value. He shook his head, angry at himself. Nonsense, he growled. But then another thought slipped in, uninvited. What if he's right? The next morning, Richard called in a favor. His private investigator, a man named Collier who had handled delicate matters for him before, answered on the first ring. I need a background check, Richard said. 17-year-old black male, name's Tyler Washington. Find out everything, where he's from, where he lives, who he knows. Leave nothing out. By afternoon, a thick file lay on Richard's desk. He opened it with the detached coolness of a man used to buying secrets. The report painted a picture he almost expected. Homeless, orphaned since 14, bounced between shelters, no stable address, no family. But then his eyes narrowed. The kid had graduated high school at 15. Straight A's, exceptional test. Scores, no criminal record, and yes, he had worked at City Hall for 6 months. Fired recently, the reason listed as insubordination. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, the file heavy in his lap. Fired for insubordination? That didn't sound like laziness. It sounded like curiosity. He dialed another number, James Parker, his longtime contact at City Hall. Jim, he said smoothly, tell me about the janitor you fired last week. Washington, right? Why'd you let him go? On the other end, Parker's voice held a nervous chuckle. Oh, him. Too smart for his own good. Kept poking around in places he didn't belong. Always asking questions about projects, trying to read documents. We caught him photographing plans in my office one night. Said it was for academic curiosity. I don't buy it. I fired him on the spot. Richard set the phone down slowly, his mind turning like a storm. So the kid had been snooping. Photographs. Documents. Maybe that explained how he knew about Lot 543 and the subway line. Maybe he'd stolen it. The thought almost made Richard relax. Yes, that was it. The boy wasn't a genius. He was just another street hustler who got lucky. And yet, Richard swirled the last of his whiskey in his glass and stared at the city lights again. Hustlers came and went. He had dealt with dozens in his career, swindlers and schemers who thought they could outsmart him. But Tyler hadn't looked like a hustler. He had looked like someone who already knew the outcome of the conversation before it began. Someone who had studied, prepared, calculated every word. For the first time in years, Richard felt something unfamiliar curling in his chest. Not fear exactly, but unease. Doubt, the kind that gnaws at the edges of certainty, whispering questions you don't want to answer. And as he sat in silence, he realized something that unsettled him more than the boy's boldness. He wanted to see him again. Richard arrived at his office the next morning earlier than usual, the city still shaking off its fog of dawn. The 42nd floor was quiet, the kind of quiet that made the hum of fluorescent lights feel louder than they should. He loosened his tie as he settled into his leather chair, the thick file on Tyler Washington spread open across the desk like a puzzle missing pieces. The boy was a contradiction, homeless yet educated beyond his years, orphaned yet carrying himself with a confidence that could rival seasoned executives. Richard leaned back, running a hand across his face. He told himself the matter should have ended yesterday. The boy had made his pitch, and Richard had walked away. That should have been it. But here he was, poring over the file, rereading each line as though hidden between the letters was an explanation that would let him forget Tyler once and for all. He flipped through pages of records, shelters, schools, jobs. Nothing added up neatly. A teenager with no family, no money, no home. Yet somehow he had compiled more insight into a property deal than Richard's million-dollar team of analysts. It wasn't luck. Richard knew luck. This wasn't it. When his assistant knocked softly on the door, announcing the day's schedule, Richard waved her away. He dialed Parker again, impatience sharpening his voice. Jim, you said the kid was caught with documents. What kind of documents? There was a pause on the other end, followed by a sigh. Architectural plans, some preliminary notes about the subway expansion. Nothing that should have meant much to him, but he was sharp, Richard, too sharp, always watching, always listening. I caught him once quoting details from a meeting he had no business knowing about. The boy doesn't forget a thing. Richard's hand tightened around the phone. Subway expansion. So the kid's claim wasn't pulled from thin air. He had seen something. The thorn of doubt drove deeper. After the call ended, Richard closed his eyes and let out a long breath. It would have been easier if Tyler were just another street hustler. Hustlers were predictable. They wanted fast money, a meal, a warm place to sleep. They didn't talk about partnerships or demand a share of profits like equals. Tyler was different. He carried himself like someone who already knew the rules of the game, and worse, how to bend them. That evening, Richard sat in his penthouse again, lights from the city sprawled out before him like a kingdom he controlled. Yet for the first time in decades, he felt the edges of that control slip. He poured another glass of whiskey, telling himself he was only entertaining curiosity, but beneath that lie was something sharper, a fear he wouldn't name. Because if the boy was right, then Richard Blackwell, master of deals, king of the city's skyline, had been outmaneuvered by a 17-year-old in torn sneakers. He pressed the rim of the glass to his lips, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. The arrogance in his smirk had faded, replaced by a question he hated himself for asking. What if the kid isn't bluffing? The city moved beneath him, restless, alive. And somewhere down there, in a library corner or a shelter cot, Tyler Washington was waiting like someone who had set a chessboard Richard didn't even realize he was standing on. And the unsettling truth was this. For the first time in years, Richard couldn't tell if he was the player or the piece. The library was quiet, the kind of quiet that wrapped itself around the shelves and made every turn of a page sound like thunder. Tyler sat at a corner table, a stack of worn textbooks surrounding him like fortress walls. His hoodie was pulled tight against the draft from the old vents, but his eyes were alive, darting across lines of urban economics as if every word carried the weight of his future. He had been there since morning, same as yesterday, same as the day before, a ghost that the librarians had learned not to chase away. Across from him sat Professor Elena Vasquez, her reading glasses balanced low on her nose as she studied a folder thick with reports. In her late 40s, she had a calm strength about her, the kind of woman who carried battles fought in silence behind her eyes. She had first noticed Tyler months ago when he appeared night after night in her favorite study hall, copying notes from library copies he couldn't afford to buy. At first, she thought he was just another kid trying to scrape by. But then she saw the way he read, not like a student cramming for exams, but like a strategist preparing for war. "Do you even sleep?" Elena asked softly, setting down her pen. Tyler glanced up, a faint grin tugging at his lips. "Sometimes," he said, "but not enough to waste time dreaming." There was something in his tone that made her chest ache. She saw in him what most people overlooked, a mind too restless to be buried under circumstance, a spirit too sharp to stay invisible. That's why she had offered him more than a quiet nod. She had begun sliding him articles, old research papers, even copies of her lectures. Over time, they had built something fragile but powerful, a partnership between a boy society had discarded and a professor who refused to ignore brilliance when she saw it. Now, as she leafed through the economic projections he had drawn up for Lot 543, she couldn't hide her astonishment. "Tyler, this is extraordinary," she whispered. "This isn't just raw data. You've mapped the ripple effect on local businesses, property taxes, even transit flow. This is the kind of work graduate students struggle to pull together." Tyler's eyes lit with a rare spark of pride, though he masked it quickly. "It's not enough just to know the land will rise in value. You have to know how the city will react, how people will move, where demand will rise next. It's like chess. One move creates 5 others. If you don't see them, you lose before you start." Elena studied him for a long moment. He wanted to ask the question she had asked before, the one he always brushed off. Why him? Why this obsession with proving himself in a world that had left him with nothing? But she saw the answer in the hardness of his jaw, in the way his fingers tightened around the pen like it was the only weapon he had. "You know, going after someone like Richard Blackwell could destroy you," she said carefully. "He's not just rich. He has power, connections, influence. Men like him don't play fair." Tyler leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the window where the city lights flickered against the dusk. "Professor, my life was destroyed a long time ago. I'm not afraid of losing. I'm afraid of never trying, of knowing I had the chance to prove them wrong and staying silent." Her throat tightened. For a moment, she saw not a boy but a soldier preparing for a battle that no one else believed he could win. And that frightened her because she knew how ruthless men like Blackwell could be. But then, Tyler reached into his bag and pulled out the battered flash drive he had handed to Richard days earlier. He set it on the table, the dull silver glinting beneath the library's yellow lights. "He thinks it's just data," Tyler said quietly. "But it's more than that. It's a map. A record of every move he's made, every shortcut he's taken, every corner he's cut. He doesn't know it yet, but I've been watching him longer than he's been watching me." Elena froze. "Tyler, what did you do?" He met her gaze, calm, unwavering. I gave him enough to believe he's in control. But the truth is, the moment he opened that drive, he walked into my game. Every file he touches, every email he forwards, every transaction he makes, it all belongs to me now. Her heart pounded, equal parts awe and fear. The boy in front of her wasn't just brilliant, he was dangerous in a way that no one saw coming. And foe. Ere the first time, Elena realized the storm brewing between a millionaire blinded by arrogance and a homeless teenager fueled by relentless determination wasn't just inevitable. It was already here. Richard's office glowed with the sterile light of computer screens as the city outside slipped into evening. He sat behind his mahogany desk, tie loosened, jacket draped over the back of his chair. The flash drive Tyler had given him lay in the USB port, humming quietly as files loaded onto his monitor. He had told himself he wasn't curious, that this was just due diligence, but the truth gnawed at him. He wanted to know. Dozens of folders filled the screen, soil reports, environmental studies, economic projections. He clicked through them with practiced detachment, the way he had reviewed 1,000 proposals before. But the more he scrolled, the more uneasy he became. Every file was meticulously sourced, cross-referenced with City Hall records, university research, and even internal communications he hadn't known were accessible. The boy hadn't been bluffing. He had data that Richard's million-dollar consultants had dismissed years ago. He leaned back, exhaling sharply. Impressive, he muttered to himself, though the word tasted sour in his mouth. Then his phone buzzed with a new email notification. It was from one of his associates, a document request he hadn't approved. Richard frowned. He checked the timestamp. It showed the request originated from his computer 10 minutes ago while he was still browsing Tyler's files. Strange, he whispered. He opened his system log. His stomach tightened. Every document he had accessed since plugging in the flash drive had been automatically copied to an external server. His emails, his contracts, his private notes on properties he hadn't even mentioned to his board yet. For a moment he couldn't breathe. His hand hovered above. The mouse, sweat gathering at the back of his neck. He yanked the flash drive out in one swift motion, as if it were a venomous snake. But the damage was already done. His system had been open for nearly an hour. Whoever had control of that drive had seen everything. Son of a... His curse died in his throat. He rose to his feet, pacing the length of his office. His mind raced, replaying every word the boy had said, every quiet pause, every subtle smile. Tyler hadn't come to him desperate. He hadn't begged. He had walked up to Richard Blackwell with the calm of someone holding a loaded gun behind his back. The intercom buzzed, startling him. His secretary's voice was cautious. Mr. Blackwell, your accountant is on line 1. He says it's urgent. Richard snatched the phone, his voice sharp. What is it? Sir? The accountant stammered. There's been suspicious activity in several of your accounts. Files have been mirrored, transactions flagged. I don't understand how, but it looks like someone has access to your internal systems. Richard's chest tightened. He ended the call without answering, staring at the flash drive still clutched in his hand. It was small, fragile, insignificant to anyone else, but to him, it now felt heavier than steel. Images of Tyler standing on the sidewalk flashed in his mind. The ragged clothes, the steady eyes, the way he said, partnership, not charity. Richard realized with a chill that the boy hadn't been asking, he had been offering, and Richard had laughed in his face. The office suddenly felt too small, the walls closing in. He loosened his collar, staring out at the city lights flickering like distant warnings. He had built his empire on the belief that he was always 3 steps ahead, always the one pulling the strings. But tonight, for the first time in decades, he felt the ground shift beneath him. Somewhere out there, in the alleys and libraries of a city Richard thought he owned, a homeless teenager was watching, waiting. And Richard had the sickening sense that he wasn't the hunter anymore. He was the prey. The following morning, Richard strode into his office with the kind of resolve he hadn't felt in years. His night had been sleepless, filled with pacing across the penthouse floor, staring at the flash drive like it was a live grenade he couldn't disarm. He had convinced himself there was a simple solution. The boy wanted money. Everyone wanted money. That was the rule of the world. Money silenced, money erased memory and ambition alike. At 9 o'clock sharp, he dictated a message to his assistant. Draft a formal offer, $5,000 consulting fee, standard confidentiality agreement attached. Deliver it today. He leaned back in his chair, almost smug as the thought settled in. To a kid living on the streets, $5,000 wasn't just money. It was survival. It was food, a bed, a chance at something better. Surely Tyler would jump at it, sign away his rights, and disappear into the anonymity where people like him belonged. Hours later, his phone buzzed with a notification. Tyler's response. Richard opened it, expecting gratitude, maybe clumsy eagerness. Instead, the words hit him like a slap. Mr. Blackwell, I am not interested in charity. My offer remains the same. 20% partnership or no deal. Richard's jaw tightened. He read the line again, his pulse quickening with disbelief. No hesitation, no thank you, no fear, just the same impossible demand, typed with the calmness of someone who knew exactly what he was worth. He stabbed at the keyboard, firing back a reply. Kid, you don't understand how the real world works. This is my final offer. Take it or find another fool for your fantasies. The reply came minutes later, fast and merciless. The real world doesn't scare me, Mr. Blackwell. It never gave me anything, so it can't take anything away. I'll be waiting when you realize that crumbs aren't enough. Richard stared at the screen, his breath heavy, his fingers curling into fists. Nobody spoke to him like that. Not partners, not rivals, not senators he'd bankrolled. And now a teenager in a torn hoodie had the audacity to dismiss him, to refuse him, to stand his ground as though they were equals. He slammed his fist onto the desk, rattling the crystal glass of water beside him. Arrogant little... His voice broke, swallowed by the sudden awareness that he wasn't angry at Tyler's arrogance. He was angry at his own unease. Because buried beneath his fury was the smallest spark of fear. Fear that the boy might actually know something he didn't. He pushed back from his desk and paced, his reflection in the glass walls of his office chasing him like an accusation. For years, he had believed his money was enough to buy anyone's silence, loyalty, or surrender. He had watched desperate men crumble under the weight of checks smaller than $5,000, but Tyler hadn't crumbled. Tyler had stood taller. For the first time in decades, Richard faced someone who couldn't be bought. And that realization wasn't just unsettling, it was dangerous. Across town, Tyler sat in the dim corner of the university library, the glow of his laptop screen illuminating his determined face. Professor Elena watched him with quiet awe as he closed the lid, satisfied with the message he'd sent. He didn't smile, he didn't gloat, he simply nodded as if another piece of his plan had clicked into place. He offered you crumbs, didn't he? Elena asked gently. 5,000, Tyler said, his tone flat, controlled. Enough to make me disappear, enough to remind me of where he thinks I belong. And you said no, she murmured, though she already knew the answer. Tyler's eyes lifted, sharp and steady. I said no, because I'm not for sale. Not now, not ever. And as Richard Blackwell paced his office, seething, and Tyler Washington closed his laptop with quiet resolve, the collision course between them tightened. Two worlds, one of arrogance, the other of determination, were about to meet head-on, and when they did, only one would walk away with power. The night was quiet, too quiet for Richard Blackwell. He sat in his office long after his employees had gone home, the city outside glowing with the usual arrogance of wealth and power. Yet inside, the air was different. Thick, suffocating, filled with the kind of silence that made his heartbeat sound louder than it should. He couldn't shake the boy's last message, I'll be waiting when you realize that crumbs aren't enough. It gnawed at him, clawed at him. No one had ever spoken to him like that and walked away untouched. He leaned forward, powering up his computer again, the flash drive still sitting on his desk like a loaded weapon. He plugged it in, convincing himself it was his choice, not the boy's, that made his hand tremble. The folders opened instantly, neatly organized, precise. He clicked through them one by one, projected property values, subway schematics, soil contamination reports. Each file was more detailed than the last. His consultants hadn't uncovered half of what this teenager had compiled. That truth burned, but what came next chilled him. A new window popped up on his screen, unprompted. At first, Richard thought it was a system error, but then the text scrolled across in crisp, taunting letters. Thank you for accessing these files, Mr. Blackwell. Every document you open confirms my research. Every move you make proves my point. Richard froze, his throat tightened. He tried to close the window, but it wouldn't vanish. Instead, another line appeared, and every keystroke is being recorded. His hands shot to the keyboard, frantic. He yanked open the system logs, his eyes widened. The boy had mirrored everything, emails, contracts, transaction records, even private memos he thought no one had ever seen. For the past 72 hours, his entire digital life had been copied, traced, and sent elsewhere. No, this isn't possible, Richard whispered, his voice trembling for the first time in years. He unplugged the flash drive with a violent jerk, his pulse racing. But the damage was already done. He could see it in the log history, dozens of transfers. Every sensitive document now existed on some hidden server Tyler controlled. Richard staggered back from his desk, his legs unsteady. For 2 decades, he had prided himself on being untouchable, A man whose secrets were buried deep beneath lawyers and shell companies. But now, in one move, a homeless teenager had stripped him bare. His phone rang, slicing through the suffocating silence. He snatched it up. It was his accountant, his voice panicked. "Mr. Blackwell, I don't know how to say this, but your accounts, some of them have been flagged. Suspicious activity. Documents you never authorized were pulled. If regulators see this..." Richard slammed the phone down before the man could finish. He could feel sweat trickling down his temple. This wasn't just about Lot 543 anymore. This was about everything. Somewhere out there, Tyler was watching him. That much Richard knew now. Watching, waiting, pulling strings like a shadowy conductor in a game Richard hadn't realized he was already playing. The arrogance that had once fueled him now felt like a curse because he had underestimated the boy. He had treated him like trash, and trash he now underawed. Could burn. He stood by the window, staring out at the city skyline he once thought he owned. The skyscrapers looked less like trophies and more like prison bars. For the first time in years, Richard Blackwell tasted fear, not the fleeting kind, but the kind that digs deep into your chest and whispers a truth you can't ignore. He wasn't the hunter anymore, he was the prey, and Tyler Washington had already set the trap. The sun had barely risen when the first wave of phone calls began. Richard Blackwell was still in bed, the silk sheets twisted around him, his mind heavy from a night of restless pacing. His phone buzzed again and again, vibrating against the nightstand until he finally snatched it up. It was his head of public relations, her voice sharp, panicked. Every word rushed. "Richard, turn on the news, now!" He stumbled out of bed, the phone pressed to his ear and fumbled for the remote. The television flickered to life, and in an instant, his heart sank. On the screen, the city's most trusted morning anchor sat with an expression that was calm but heavy, the kind reserved for stories that would ripple through the community. Behind her, graphics flashed. Blackwell Enterprises under investigation. Richard's breath caught. The anchor's voice carried into the room like a hammer pounding against his skull. The Securities and Exchange Commission announced this morning a formal investigation into billionaire real estate mogul Richard Blackwell. Allegations include insider trading, money laundering, and misuse of confidential city planning documents. Leaked evidence suggests years of illegal dealings tied to City Hall officials. The broadcast shifted to images, confidential memos with his signature, architectural plans stamped restricted, and damning financial records that Richard knew with a sickening certainty had only existed on his private servers. He staggered backward, gripping the edge of his dresser for balance, his face drained of color. He wanted to believe this was a nightmare, some cruel trick of the press, but every document that flashed across the screen was real. His documents, his deals, exposed. Another phone call lit up his screen. "Parker," Richard answered in a fury. "What the hell is going on, Jim?" On the other end, Parker's voice was trembling. "They've got everything, Richard. The lunches, the contracts, the payments, even the recordings." Richard froze. "What recordings?" "The security system. My office. Every conversation. Every word we ever said. They have it all. Someone must have redirected the feeds. Richard, they're playing clips on the news. They have us on tape." Richard's knees buckled, and he sank onto the bed. The TV was still running in the background, now showing grainy audio clips of his voice, calm and calculating as he discussed kickbacks and insider tips with Parker over steak dinners. His empire was being dismantled in front of the world before he had even finished his first cup of coffee. His phone buzzed again, this time a text message. He opened it, his fingers trembling. It was from an unknown number. "Mr. Blackwell, are you watching the news? I told you I had a proposal that could change your life. You chose arrogance. Now you're watching the price of that choice." Richard's blood ran cold. Tyler, the boy, the flash drive. He dialed the number instantly, his heart racing. Tyler answered on the first ring, his voice steady, almost calm. "You," Richard growled, his chest heaving. "You did this. You ruined me." "No, Mr. Blackwell," Tyler replied softly. "You ruined yourself. All I did was hold up a mirror." Richard paced, his voice cracking with rage. "Do you know who I am? Do you know what I can do to you?" "I know exactly who you are," Tyler said, his T1 unshaken. "And I know what you've done. That's why the world knows now too. You told me once the real world doesn't hand out partnerships to kids like me, but here's the truth. The real world doesn't protect men like you forever." Through the receiver, Richard could hear the faint murmur of the library in the background, pages turning, footsteps echoing across linoleum floors. The image of that boy, calm, surrounded by books, while Richard's empire collapsed in real time, made Richard's stomach twist with a humiliation deeper than any courtroom could deliver. On the television, reporters were already gathering outside Blackwell Enterprises, cameras pointed at the glass towers that bore his name. Employees were being interviewed, investors calling for answers. The walls were closing in, faster than Richard could push them back, and all because he had underestimated a boy in worn sneakers. Richard slammed his office door shut, the sound echoing down the empty hallway. The blinds were drawn, the television muted, though the damning headlines still scrolled mercilessly across the bottom of the screen. His phone was hot in his hand, Tyler's number staring back at him like a lifeline and a noose all at once. He hit call again, his throat dry, his pulse hammering. Tyler answered on the first ring. "Mr. Blackwell." His tone was calm, maddeningly calm, as though the boy knew every card in the deck and wasn't afraid to lay them down. Richard's voice cracked with desperation, the smooth authority that once commanded boardrooms now frayed and raw. Listen to me, kid, we can fix this. I'll give you what you asked for, 20%, hell, 50%. You want a partnership? Fine, it's yours. Just help me stop this before it destroys everything." On the other end, silence stretched. Then Tyler's voice came low and steady. "Now you're ready to talk about partnership, after offering me crumbs, after laughing in my face?" "This isn't about pride," Richard snapped, pacing the length of the room, tugging at his collar like it was choking him. "This is survival, for both of us. If you keep pushing, the whole thing comes crashing down and you'll be dragged into it too. You don't understand how deep this goes." Tyler's reply was soft, but it cut sharper than any shout. "I understand perfectly. You built your empire by cutting corners, buying silence, treating people like tools to be used and thrown away. I offered you a chance to do something clean, something right. You chose greed. You chose arrogance. And now you want me to save you from the fire you lit yourself." Richard stopped pacing, his knees nearly buckling. He lowered his voice, his pride dissolving into begging. "Please, I have a family, children. Do you want them to see me in handcuffs? Do you want to ruin their lives too?" For a moment, Tyler was quiet. Then he exhaled, and his words carried not anger, but something heavier, disappointment. "Do you ever hear yourself? How many families lost their homes because of your schemes? How many kids slept on streets because you manipulated markets and jacked up rents? You didn't care when it was them. You only care now because it's you." Richard pressed a trembling hand to his forehead, sweat slick against his skin. "I can change," he whispered. "Just give me a chance, one chance." On the line, Tyler's voice shifted, no longer a boy's voice, but something steadier, older, forged in the fire of everything he had endured. "You had your chance, Mr. Blackwell. You had it when I stood in front of you with nothing but a crumpled paper and an idea. You had it when I asked for partnership, not charity. You chose to show me as worthless. That was your mistake, and mistakes have consequences." Richard felt his chest tighten, his breath shallow. The silence between them was suffocating. Outside, sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder, closer. He turned toward the window, the red and blue lights already bouncing against the glass of his office tower. His voice broke, ragged with fear. "They're here." "Yes," Tyler said quietly, "because I called them." The line went dead, leaving Richard alone with the weight of his downfall pressing on him from all sides. His hands shook as the pounding on his office door began, 3 sharp knocks that echoed like a verdict already written. For the first time in decades, Richard Blackwell, the man who thought he owned the city, realized he owned nothing. Not his freedom, not his name, not even his future. And all because a boy he had dismissed as nothing had stood his ground and refused to be bought. The pounding on Richard's office door grew louder, each knock like a hammer blow against his chest. He stumbled back, sweat dripping down his temple, his heart beating so hard it rattled his ribs. When the door finally burst open, the sound was deafening. 3 federal agents swept into the room, their voices crisp, their presence undeniable. "Richard Blackwell," the lead agent announced, his voice echoing against the polished glass and steel. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit insider trading, money laundering, and corruption of a public official." The words sliced through the air, heavy and final. Richard opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came out. For a man who had built empires with his voice, who had closed deals with the force of a single word, the silence was the cruelest humiliation. One agent pulled his hands behind his back, cold steel snapping shut around his wrists. He flinched at the metallic bite, the scent Sound of the cuffs locking ringing louder than any siren outside. Employees crowded the hallway, staring in shock as their untouchable leader was marched past them like a criminal. Some whispered, some gasped. A few, the ones who had felt the weight of his arrogance most, looked on with something Richard recognized instantly: satisfaction. Downstairs, cameras flashed in a relentless storm. Reporters shouted his name, their questions sharp and merciless. "Mr. Blackwell, how long have you been working with city officials? Did you use insider information? Are you prepared for a 20-year sentence?" The chaos swallowed him whole, the flashes of light immortalizing his fall. For the first time in 20 years, Richard Blackwell wasn't the man people envied. He was the man people pointed at, the man whose story had become a warning. Across town, the university library buzzed with a different kind of energy. Tyler Washington sat with Professor Elena at his side, the glow of a laptop illuminating his face. The live news broadcast played on mute, showing Richard being led away in handcuffs. Students stopped as they passed, some recognizing Tyler, whispering about the homeless kid who had brought down a giant. But Tyler didn't gloat. He didn't smile. His eyes were steady, his expression calm, as though this had always been about more than revenge. Elena touched his arm gently. "It's over," she said softly. Tyler shook his head. "No, Professor. This is just the beginning." Later that afternoon, Tyler stood on the empty lot at Central Avenue. The same forgotten land Richard had once dismissed as worthless now stretched out before him, bathed in golden sunlight. Papers rustled in his hands, the deed, freshly signed, the ink still drying. The property was his, secured through university-backed financing that had trusted his research more than any billionaire ever had. He looked at the cracked ground, the weeds pushing stubbornly through the dirt, and he saw what no one else had dared to see: home. As rising from the dust, lights shining in windows where kids like him would sleep safely, books piled high in a community library, classrooms alive with possibility. "This place," he whispered almost to himself, "will be different. It'll be for the kids no one sees, for the ones everyone calls invisible." Elena stood beside him, her eyes glistening. "You've turned survival into vision, Tyler. That's something no one can take away from you." The city skyline loomed in the distance, the same towers where Richard once believed he controlled everything. But now, one man's empire was collapsing while another's was just beginning to rise. For Richard, the fall had been swift, brutal, final. For Tyler, the rise was steady, built not on arrogance but on resilience, intelligence, and a refusal to accept crumbs when he deserved a seat at the table. And in that moment, standing on cracked earth with the future unfolding in his mind, Tyler Washington wasn't just a homeless teenager anymore. He was the architect of something bigger than wealth, something that could outlast every skyscraper on the horizon. 6 months later, the air on Central Avenue no longer carried the smell of dust and abandonment. The lot that had once been forgotten, a place the city turned its back on, now pulsed with life. A row of new brick buildings stretched across the block, windows gleaming in the sun. Banners fluttered overhead, the Washington Vasquez Housing Center. Hundreds of people had gathered for the opening ceremony: students, professors, community leaders, families who had spent too many nights in shelters. Camera crews jostled for space, eager to capture the story that had already captured the city's imagination. On stage stood Tyler Washington, no longer the boy in ragged clothes, though his hoodie was still folded neatly in his bag as a reminder of where he had come from. He wore a plea blazer, borrowed for the occasion, his posture steady, his gaze calm but alive. When he stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell into silence. "I was told once," Tyler began, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, "that the real world doesn't hand out partnerships to kids like me, that the best I could hope for were crumbs, and that I should take them and be grateful. But I learned something living on the streets, something more powerful than money. Dignity is worth more than crumbs." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, others wiped at their eyes. "I didn't build this place for myself," he continued. "I built it for every young person who was ever told they weren't enough, for every student who had to choose between eating and studying, for every kid who slept on benches while skyscrapers around them touched the sky. This is proof that the world changes when we refuse to accept what it tries to hand us, and instead demand what we know we deserve." Applause rose, loud and thunderous, washing over him. Beside the stage, Professor Elena Vasquez clapped hardest of all, pride and emotion shining in her eyes. Far across town, in the gray confines of a federal prison, Richard Blackwell sat on a hard bench, staring at a television bolted high on the wall. Inmates around him muttered and laughed, pointing at the screen. The news anchor smiled as she covered the ribbon-cutting ceremony. There was Tyler, standing tall, a 17-year-old who had not only survived the streets but built something the city could no longer ignore. The camera zoomed in as Tyler held up a golden key, handed to him symbolically by the mayor. Richard leaned forward, his jaw clenched, his throat tight. The very land he had once dismissed as worthless was now a beacon of hope, a monument to the boy he had underestimated. An inmate sitting beside him chuckled. "Irony, huh? Kid you tried to buy off as building an empire while you rot in here." Richard said nothing. His eyes stayed locked on the screen. Atching the crowd cheer, watching the boy's vision come alive. Every clap of thunderous applause echoed like a sentence heavier than the 22 years the judge had given him. Back on stage, Tyler concluded his speech with words that silenced even the clicking of camera shutters. "Many people told me revenge would feel sweet, but this..." He gestured to the buildings behind him, the families waiting to move in, the children tugging at their parents' hands with excitement. "This is better, because revenge destroys, justice builds, and I didn't come here to destroy. I came here to build." The audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation, the sound rolling like a wave down the block. Tyler stepped back from the microphone, his chest rising with controlled breaths, his eyes scanning the horizon as if he could already see the future stretching farther than any tower in the skyline. In that moment, the story was no longer about a homeless teenager or a fallen millionaire. It was about a truth as old as time. Power without integrity crumbles, but vision born from struggle endures. And for everyone watching, whether from the streets of the city, the comfort of their homes, or the cold walls of a prison cell, the message was undeniable. Sometimes the most shocking part of a story isn't the fall of the powerful, it's the rise of the invisible.